Hey guys, welcome to the Real Estate Startup Podcast. I am Benjamin and this is Michaela. And we are so excited to have Jordan on today. Jordan Mollenauer, who is a friend of mine who I met recently at a Braveco conference here in Redding. He is from Knoxville, Tennessee. And we co-led a group at this conference and we started connecting immediately about business and real estate. And just some of his stories were just so crazy that really hooked me in. Like the first story of him essentially winning a coin toss to be able to buy a property. And then I just kept asking him questions and I started hearing stories about how one of his businesses has 600 employees and him and his business partner bought a jet. So, I mean, just very high level business entrepreneur, real estate investor who just had so much knowledge and wisdom. And I was like taken back. I was like, this guy is a treasure and mentor me, please. I'm like, I just want to be around this guy because he's just so cool. And he wasn't flaunting it. He wasn't like telling me much about net worth or any of those things. And I think a lot of times guys and girls that are at that level, they don't really flaunt and share, how much money they have. And I think that's awesome. So it was really cool having him on. I wish we could have, interviewed him for hours because there's so much to learn from Jordan. Michaela, what did you think about our talk?
Yeah, no, I loved it. I think, just to your point, like it was really cool just to see how even in the short amount of time we had, it's very clear we could do so many more shows with him on it just because he's learned so much. He has so much experience, so much wisdom. But I think that's something I really loved is that he was just here to share principles and concepts of things that they've learned and also the things they've had value for a really long time. I mean, he started when he was basically 12 years old. And so I just loved kind of hearing his journey with that. And then kind of the very end, we kind of talk about just what it looks like to intersect, family and business and some of the things he's learned along the way with that too. So just a really cool conversation that felt really down to earth. And I didn't know him as well. I still don't know him as well, but kind of very cool to just see like, this is like a very, very successful high level person who's just really generous with their time and knowledge. So yeah, I loved it. I hope you guys love it as well. So yeah, let's dive in.
And one thing I want to add is I've always wondered like how young can you buy real estate? And so it was cool to hear that he was buying real estate before he had a driver's license. Yeah. And that blows my mind.
Like, what?
Yeah, that's just crazy. So I'm feeling hopeful that maybe my kids can buy real estate. Can they buy real estate in middle school? That would be next level.
I mean, cash is king, right?
Yeah.
If they have cash, I mean, I don't know if it matters how old you are, but I mean, that is something that stood out to me as well. I was just like thinking about just the power of empowering kids to really understand. I mean, kids who are interested, not every kid is going to be interested in this, but like, I think there are a lot of kids that if they just had a little bit of guidance, they could do some really cool stuff at a much younger age if they wanted to. So,
I mean, the fact that his dad was a lawyer and then he was talking about how he was reading the code book, the construction code book, like multiple times as a teenager. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, you're not normal. You're not
this
normal.
Is not normal. No, that's so cool though.
So yeah, excited to interview Jordan. Here's the show. I met Jordan at Braveco, which was the men's conference at Bethel, and we co-led a group, and it was really fun to meet him and his son. And but anyways, we would break out and we'd have lunch, and he started telling me the story about one of his properties, and he told me a story basically that he won a property over a coin flip, and I thought that was the craziest story I've ever heard. And so I just thought that would be a great opener, is hearing Jordan's story on how you won a property by flipping a coin.
Yeah, let's go.
Sure, I can do that. I guess I'll start by clarifying that I had to actually pay for the property too. I didn't just win it with a coin toss. It was the coin toss was the right to execute a right of first refusal. But Yeah, the context is our family had bought a piece of property on a small island that we had developed, but built a small kind of a beach type cottage. And by nature of owning property on this island, you had by default a right of first refusal in the event that someone else on the island chooses to sell their property. And it's a unique place. It's a 38-acre island, so it has no roads. There's no bridge to it. You have to get there by boat. So it's quite a challenge to develop anything on this at this location. But one of the other property owners had contracted to sell their house, and as a result, they notified the other owners, and we each had the right to essentially claim the contract. Agree to paying the same price and under the same terms as the contract, and essentially assume the contract. And me and another property owner had independently moved to execute that right, and within unknowingly the other, of course. And then after a couple of days, I got a call from an attorney. This is in Florida. Got a call from an attorney down in Florida, and they said, "Hey, my client has exercised their right. You need to go away, essentially, and he's going to purchase this house." And at the time, I didn't really care that much. It wasn't a focus of mine. It wasn't something that I was avidly pursuing. It was really just kind of an opportunity that had fallen into my lap. But there had been some history with this other owner who had kind of been known to push others around and had a reputation for being very litigious. And I didn't take kindly to the posture that they had taken, but I also didn't really feel like, I just thought life's too short to litigate everything and to fight with people. It's better to be a peacekeeper when you can. But on the same hand, I'm not a pushover, and I don't like it when people bully others. And I perceived that was happening at some level in this case. So I was kind of grappling with, what do I do here? Do I bow up and fight this thing? And I had read the documents, and I was familiar with the facts, and I thought I actually had a much better case that I had exercised the right appropriately in first. But on the other hand, I've got 4 kids, and again, life is short, and there's a lot of other things to spend time and energy on. And so I was trying to figure out, how do I navigate this in a way that doesn't just capitulate, but also doesn't burn up a bunch of time and energy and resource. And kind of landed with the idea of just proposing that we toss a coin over it. So I called back the attorney and I said, "Look, I'm going to be down there on Friday. I've got to check on another construction project. Why don't we just meet at high noon at the local restaurant bar, and we'll flip a coin?" So we ended up negotiating I think it was a 5 or 6 page agreement that explains sort of the contours of what this coin flip is supposed to look like. And one of the terms was that the winner had to buy the loser lunch as part of the deal. So sure enough, we agreed to it, signed it. I came down that Friday, and I walk into this local restaurant bar, and I think there were maybe 6 or 7 people there. They had a bunch of attorneys from their office who had showed up to, I guess, witness this phenomena. And I was in shorts and flip flops, and had a backpack I had just flown in that morning. So we did it in about 5 minutes. We did the best 2 out of 3, and I won the right to subsequently close on the house. And then I bought lunch for a whole bunch of people, and we had some good laughs over it. And I've actually become fast friends with this. The fellow that I actually flipped the coin with was a business partner of the original the attorney's client. So he and I have since become fast friends, and he's a really great guy, and we have a fun story to relate back to. So I think it's an example of trying to think about the deal in a bit broader context, and not becoming too fixated on sort of linear thinking. And I found that to be helpful over time with not just in real estate, but in business in general, trying to identify the solutions that aren't necessarily along this sort of ABC path that we're taught or that we learn in either business school or from others around us, and really trying to step back and think about, okay, what's the real problem here, and are we considering the full menu of options, and are there things that are outside of that linear path of thinking, what some people would refer to as sort of out of the box thinking? Are there things outside of the box that we can leverage to advance this forward in some way that either doesn't cost as much or doesn't take as long, or that doesn't create friction, or that doesn't, result in some other unintended consequence? And it's a fun story, but I think the lessons that I drew from it really were just, it was a reminder to to not just get sucked into a sort of battle mode and not just to get locked, to avoid locking horns where you can, to be a peacemaker where you can. But being a peacemaker doesn't mean being a pushover. But sometimes it just requires you think about it a little bit differently.
That's so good.
I love that story. I think it's so cool. And I love your takeaway that you weren't a pushover and that you could have just been like, yeah, whatever, you can have it. And you can also have creative solutions, like the fact that you're like, let's just flip a coin. That was a cool way of just trying to settle something. So awesome, man. Well, thanks for sharing that. I would love to just, kind of jump back into just like, how you got started in real estate. Like what's your journey look like with real estate before flipping coins and winning the rights to buy property?
Yeah. I think it starts when I was probably 12 or 13 years old. At that age, I was beginning to become curious about the world that I was growing up in, and the not just the work world, but how the system works, how people create things and build things, and started reading a lot about it at a pretty young age, about business in general. And I had the good fortune of having a grandfather who owned just a small handful of rental properties, and we would go visit him in the summertime, and we would become conscripted labor for a few weeks in the summertime. Always paid, usually less than minimum wage, but always paid something. Either cleaning up the yard or mowing grass or what have you. But I always was very curious about why he chose to own these properties and what the benefits were and what some of the challenges were, and started to really pique my interest at that point. And then I would say over the next year or two, started to become more interested in construction and not just the concept of renting property, but also developing and creating the properties from the beginning. And, I ended up, I guess the first property I owned, I borrowed $5,000 from my grandfather. I had saved up $10,000 and I bought a tract of land for $15,000. So I was way over levered on my first deal. I had very little liquidity afterwards, but I had intended to subdivide that property and sell it off. And I did that a few times over the course of really just, kind of my teenage years, kind of going into kind of through high school, bought little lots and I would subdivide them and sell them, or I bought a little rental house and learned to screen tenants. And I think one of the biggest lessons I started to learn early on was that any business, whether it's real estate or otherwise, it really is about people. Even something as seemingly defined as real estate, when you're buying an asset and you're going to just rent it out, it ultimately is deeply intertwined with people's personal lives, both on the buy side. Some of the best deals that we've done over the course of our careers have been not as a result of being the highest bidder per se on an asset, but being in the right place at the right time with the right solution for someone who had a problem that they needed to solve, whether it was a liquidity problem or a health issue, or they just wanted more time to do other things. I recognized early on that the business of real estate really is about people. Again, I use the example of the buy side. On the sell side, it's the same thing. In tenanting a property, it's the same thing. You're trying to find solutions for people who have challenges or who have opportunities that they want to take advantage of. And if you lose sight of the people aspect of the business and you start to think about it just in terms of an asset or sort of through the lens of a balance sheet, I think you really lose sight of why people make the decisions that they make. So early on, it was being exposed to the field through my grandfather, and then just an interest in building and creating. I think innately, it's just a lot of fun to take a raw piece of land and to turn it into something that other people find useful and helpful and that they're willing to pay for.
And you were doing that as a teenager?
Yeah, I started out as I guess I owned my first property at 15. And then
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I convinced my dad to buy an apartment complex at age 17. And my offer to him was, if you'll buy this complex, I'll fix it up and manage it for you. The complex had been partially condemned. It was in really bad shape. It was a challenging asset to begin with, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But over the course of a couple of years, we renovated it and got it turned around, and it ended up being a really good investment for him. And that's really the point at which I would say I really began to realize that understanding people and understanding understanding the places they come from and the challenges that they're faced with is as much a part of this business as anything else, because our tenant base at the time, they were just coming from a very different place in life than I had been familiar with, and learning how to navigate some of the challenges that they faced. If their car broke down and they couldn't get to work and they couldn't pay the rent, I had to anticipate how I was going to respond to that, and when to give grace, when to give time, and when to take a more firm position, and how to discern fact from fiction. It was a real crunch course in learning how to relate to people that just came from a very different walk of life.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating that at that age you were pursuing buying real estate in really creative ways. What sparked that in you? Like, what motivated you? And do you have siblings that were doing the same thing? Was your granddad or your parents encouraging this, or how did that get in you to make you want to pursue these things?
I wish I had a good answer for that. My theory is that there's probably some DNA sequence that is the real estate bug, and somehow I got that DNA. It really didn't come from anyone pushing me in that direction or even encouraging me in that direction at all. I think it just came from a deep desire to plant and create and build. And I say plant because I think a lot of real estate and business more broadly is not about hunting deals as much as it is planting the seeds that over time can become prosperous. And it requires patience, and it requires diligence, and it requires foresight and commitment. But very few things come quickly, but they can come methodically. And I just enjoyed the process of planting seeds and over time seeing them grow and become something, not in a, horticultural sense, but in a business sense. And real estate's a great example of where you can plant seeds of opportunity, and over time, they can grow and become something that can benefit not just you as the investor, but benefit the customer or the tenant or your family or the community as a whole. So I enjoy seeing that process unfold.
That's awesome, man. I feel like you're a rarity, especially at that age, just to have that kind of maturity and vision and creativity. And I'm really curious how you saved up money at that age. Like, did you have a job? Like, what kind of job did you have? And how did it go splitting the lots, like when you did that early on?
Yeah, so I started working at about 12. I worked at essentially a grocery store that was within walking distance of my house, making $4 an hour. So it took me a while to get my seed money. It took me, I worked there for 4 years, so from 12 to 16 or so. And, had saved up that first, $10,000 or so that I mentioned. And, that was essentially the beginning of the journey. The first one of the things that I did that was not how a typical teenager would spend his time is, I would go to the Register of Deeds office in our local municipal building, and I would spend a lot of time looking for properties, searching properties. My dad is an attorney and had taught me how to kind of the basic elements of how to do a title search. And I spent a lot of time getting to know pretty much everybody in that department and learning the process of how you subdivide property and what zoning means and how it works. And I think early on, one of the skills that I sort of fell into was being able to look at a small tract of land and very quickly determine, hey, this can be subdivided. It has the necessary road frontage and access to utilities, and it has the proper zoning and a handful of other things to be able to become something that others aren't seeing. And that I did that a number of times over. I think some people helped me along the way just because they were so unaccustomed to seeing someone under the age of 60, in the Register of Deeds office. So they were always kind of finding ways to help me. But it really did. I'd say that was probably when I first started to get traction, is realizing that the advantage that I brought was not cash. It wasn't even about the asset itself as much as understanding the process by which you can take something that others think is worth, $15,000, and over the course of a couple of months, subdividing it into 2 or 3 lots that are, in combination worth, $35,000 or $40,000, and then just washing and rinsing and repeating that process a few times over. So that's a principle that I would say, again, kind of folds into this sort of nonlinear thinking, is, recognizing that, real estate's not like a share of common stock that you might purchase, on the NASDAQ. It's not something that's valued as quantitatively. There's a lot of qualitative valuation and perspective that you have to apply, which can increase the risk in the sense that, you can find yourself overpaying for an asset because you see it through sort of a rosy lens when the market really doesn't. But there's also opportunities to recognize when the market doesn't see the value in the asset until it's unlocked. And if you can figure out how to put that key in and unlock it, you can be rewarded for that. So I'd say that was kind of the beginning of that, constantly challenging myself and trying to challenge our team in thinking about an asset, not as just an individual asset on its surface, but really trying to understand what can it become? And then more importantly, in many cases, what is the system into which it fits, which I'd like to talk about that at some point in our time together today. But thinking about it in just different terms.
That's amazing. I love that you said that, just kind of like unlocking, a property, because I feel like that's really how money's made in real estate, is seeing an opportunity that other people don't see through various ways of, like you said, dividing land or renovations or increasing income through different avenues. And so I feel like that's one thing that I try to really teach new investors, like, hey guys, like there's so many opportunities out there that people don't see or don't want to take that risk. And that's the beauty of real estate. And you can be creative. You don't have to, there's leverage and all these ways of doing it that you can't do in stocks and you can't do in sometimes business. But for you, it sounded like, you started learning at an early age. Was there a tipping point that kind of made you go like, wow, like this is what I want to do, or I want to go all in? Is there a moment that you're like, man, this is it?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that there was a moment. I would say there was probably a season. I've always enjoyed finding people older and wiser and just asking a lot of questions and trying to glean from them the insights that I haven't yet attained. And I remember a conversation. I had a friend of mine, I would go to his house. This is in grade school. I would go to his house and I would always find myself kind of marveling at how big their house was. And just it was a very different environment than what I was, accustomed to. And his dad was a real estate investor of sorts. They mostly built houses and sold houses. And it was a pretty simple business model. The houses that they were building were not extravagant. They were very sort of cookie cutter, to use that term. And I remember one time when I was 16 years old, I had just gotten my driver's license. So I had a little bit more freedom. And I had called up my friend's dad and just said, hey, can I meet you and just ask you some questions? And he was in the process of opening a bank. He was, an investor in a kind of a community bank. And he said, sure, why don't you come on down to our bank and we'll sit down and we'll talk. So I'm sitting in this boardroom and I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna get a download of like grand wisdom here from this guy who owns this bank, and he's got all this success in real estate and construction. And I asked him, I think my first question was, like, what is the key to the success that you've achieved? And of course, I was thinking in financial terms at the time. And his response was, buy low, sell high. And I really didn't get much more out of that meeting. He was not a man of many words. And again, their business model was pretty simple. And to my knowledge, they've never done anything other than build basically the same floor plan over and over and over and over again, probably hundreds, if not thousands of times. But I left the meeting a little disappointed because I thought, I was ready. I had a notepad and everything. I was ready to take a lot of notes. And there wasn't a lot more conversation beyond that. But over time, I began to realize that, sometimes the simplest concepts are, in fact, the ones that are the the shortest path to where you want to go. And, real estate, but because it's not a market priced asset, it really does create a wide range of pricing disparity where you can in fact buy low and you can sell high, whether it's, actually disposing of the asset or tenanting the asset or whatever. You can create a degree of separation between whatever cost you have in the asset and whatever you're able to get for it. So I would say that was a moment where I started to really think of that experience was, I think, the beginning of when I started to really think about real estate, not in terms of buying this and selling that and buying this and selling that in sort of mechanical terms, as much as stepping back and thinking, okay, what is actually happening here? Like, what are the complexities that are behind the scenes here? And that's really, I'll go back to the kind of the opening comments about recognizing that, people make decisions, even in business. In fact, I would say most often in business, and certainly in real estate, not purely objectively or quantitatively. There are a lot of circumstances and personal circumstances that flow into the decisions that people make. And that's also one of the reasons why you can have just widely different pricing for real estate assets, among others. And a lot of it has to do with, I'll go back to either a person's burnt out and they just want to spend their time doing something else, or their team has changed. Something's happened on their team and they no longer want to maintain a part of their business or a particular asset group because the people that are on their team they no longer have that person on their team, or it can simply be that they just want to cash out and do something that's more interesting or find some other creative outlet. So you really have to, I learned to really appreciate not just looking at the asset as a real estate asset, but really trying to understand the story behind it and why the person might be interested in selling it, and whether or not there's ways that I could best become a solution to whatever problem it is that they have beyond just paying the highest price.
So as you progressed in real estate, were you dabbling with different, asset classes? You mentioned land, you talked your dad into buying a multifamily apartment building. Walk us through like your journey, in your 20s, your 30s. Did you find something you're like, hey, I like this, I'm good at it? Or did you dabble? What did that journey look like from there to where you're at today?
Yeah. So early teenage years, dabbling with a few different types of assets that you mentioned. When I was 18 or 19 years old, decided that it was time I wanted to get into construction specifically. I wanted to build. I wanted to not just sell a raw piece of land to someone who's going to do something with it. I wanted to actually create something more. So I went and worked for an uncle for a summer. I think I was actually 17. I went and worked for my uncle one summer, who owns a construction company, and learned how to, as they say, swing a hammer, and learned how to use a tape measure. And I think we built some garages and did some additions on some houses. And I believed at the time, I thought, well, I'll learn how to build, and then I'll come back that summer, and then I'll be ready to go. And I more or less did that. I mean, I certainly didn't have the experience level at that time that I would advise others, to have. But I came back with at least a basic knowledge of how it works. And, I bought a copy of the code book at the time that you had to know in order to get your contractor's license. And I read it, I think twice. I read every page and probably spent way too much time. Awesome. And when I was old enough, I think 18 at the time was the minimum age, I got my contractor's license and started to build small homes. And I essentially built, a very similar, very simple little floor plan to the one that my friend's dad had built a career out of. And that really became the story for the next probably 4 or 5 years, going into college, just running a construction company. And, that's not an easy business. It's especially when you're very young, and I looked even younger. So it can be a challenging industry. You're dealing with a lot of variables. You're dealing with a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different skill sets. You're dealing with weather. You're dealing with codes issues and neighbors who might not be happy that you're building a house next to them, and just a lot of different things. So it was kind of a crunch course, really, again, on the human element of the business, because I found myself spending most of my time not with a tape measure or building anything as much as trying to manage a team and trying to get, the plumber to get along with the HVAC person when they were getting in each other's way, and talking with the neighbor who was upset because we were building a house in the first place, or meeting with the codes inspector and trying to convince him that I actually know what I'm talking about. It really became a study in people, in building a team, and in kind of leading that process forward. And I did that for, I guess, 4 or 5 years. Met my business partner in college, and we started working together. He was also doing some real estate investing at the time, and we over the course of probably a year or so ended up deciding to become business partners. And we've done real estate ever since at some level, but we really focused on the construction business at that point. And for the next few years, we borrowed a lot of money from banks, and we bought a lot of land, and we developed a lot of lots, and we built, I don't know, probably 150 or so homes over the course of that time. And we worked with some software developer to build some software this was before the iPad had come out. So this is kind of pre-mobile device. We had built some web-based software that helped us manage the construction process and accounting and insurance and a handful of other things. And our ambitions were to build a big real estate portfolio of companies. And we had a real estate brokerage and a mortgage company, and the software that we wanted to start licensing out to other developers. And then we had our own subdivision projects and construction arm and the property management. So we had this portfolio of real estate related companies, and had grown them very aggressively, and had spent many, many, many hours each week building that enterprise. And then 2008 hit. And that was a really tough time. 2008, 9, and half of 2010 was a really tough time. We essentially lost everything that we had. We had to start over. We were very levered. We had an older gentleman who was very wise tell us at some point during that process. He said, "Boys, your problem is you've got an elephant's appetite and you've got a bird's rear end," essentially. And what he was trying to convey was, our appetite for growing and doing and building was, close to insatiable. Like, we just wanted to really grow this thing. And in our digestive tract, our actual capacity to do that was being far exceeded. And we realized that, in 2008 and 9, when we realized how over-levered we were. And, we spent, I guess, 2.5 years kind of working out that process. And we had, I think when Lehman filed bankruptcy, which in 2008, September 2008, which was kind of the turning point for us anyways, that's when the banks in our market just essentially closed shop. And just made kind of blanket, demands on loans. We had, I think, 30 something houses under construction, another 60 or so lots that were sort of getting ready to go into development. Some of those had been pre-sold, some have not been, but of course nobody could get financing, so it didn't matter if they were pre-sold or not. So it was just a big mess. And that was a real, I would say, humbling experience. Leading up to that time, I'll go back to a previous comment about construction. In the construction industry, you have to be kind of tough to really be in that business, because you're just dealing with a lot of adversity in circumstance. But I had taken the position of being, kind of a tough guy. Like, I had high expectations of my subcontractors. I had very detailed checklists of what was acceptable in terms of the quality control for how I wanted the plumbing done, and the trim carpentry and the paint and all these other trades. And I had a pretty robust sort of accountability system. And that was good in the sense that it created a better product, but it also kind of put me in a position of constantly applying pressure to my subcontractor base and having to hold them accountable in some meaningful ways, to include, I remember this one rule that we had: if you were caught on the site with a cigarette, I would charge $1,000, and I just put that in their contracts. And I instituted it a handful of times to kind of make the point. But that was kind of the posture that I had taken, is I mean business, and I'm willing to back that with $1,000 fine if you smoke in my customer's house. And having to go back to those subcontractors and explain to them that I couldn't pay their bills because my lines of credit had all been frozen, and I didn't have any liquidity. And having to go back to them and try to and ask them to give me time to pay them back and to let me make payments over time was a good experience. It was one that I needed to have. It was a very humbling experience. I remember distinctively, I was in law school at the time, and I remember that Christmas break, my friends were all going home and having Christmas break, and I had basically just set up back-to-back meetings with all of my subcontractors at the local Starbucks because I thought I need a public place because I'm not sure how this is going to go down. And if one of these guys jumps on top of me, it's probably best that we're not on a job site somewhere alone. And that was a tough set of meetings. I think I had maybe 30 or so of those meetings over the course of a week or so. But what I would say is the thing that I drew from that was, as hard as I'd been on these guys, and as much as we had pushed them to do more and be better, and as much as we had demanded of them, they were all very gracious to me when I came back to them and just said, I'm sorry, I don't have the money to pay you, and if you give me time and trust me, I will get you paid back, but I don't have, we simply don't have the money in the bank account. And they were all under a lot of pressure themselves at the time because the whole industry was just a big train wreck, and they weren't being paid by any of their general contractors. So they were under sort of financial duress themselves, but nonetheless, they were all very gracious to us. And that's always stuck with me because they didn't have to be. I mean, I had not given them the same level of patience and grace that they were giving me at that point. So that gets us through kind of 2008. At that point, we kind of unwound things over 2008, 2009, 2010. We started some other businesses during that time, got into e-commerce and warehousing fulfillment. We bought some other businesses, sold a few, and then eventually got into some manufacturing businesses, some service businesses. And we still are in real estate, and it's still a big part of what we do, mostly industrial at this point. But 2008 was definitely a turning point for us. It forced us to take a step back and try to figure out what other opportunities we could pursue outside of real estate, because at least at that time, it was pretty clear that our opportunities with no liquidity whatsoever were going to be very limited, and we had to find something else to do. And I would say I'm grateful for the experience. It definitely taught me a lot. I wouldn't want to do it again.
Wow. It sounds like being a contractor, you said you had to be tough. I mean, part of that, it sounds like it really prepared you for the recession, because to have to start over again, and I don't know, did you have to file bankruptcy at all? Was that part of the story, or how'd you deal with your debt?
We eventually did pay all of our subcontractors back, and we essentially, all the houses that we had under construction, we essentially converted those into rental properties because at the time, because nobody could get a home loan, you had a lot of people in the market who kind of suddenly found themselves in the rental market. So we were able to reposition those assets and essentially stop some of the cash bleed with rental income, and then over the course of a couple of years, we were able to sell everything off and pay the banks back and make people whole. But it was, I didn't know from week to week. I mean, I remember it distinctly. Like I remember distinctly what it feels like to be in that position, and how at times desperate it can feel when it doesn't seem like you have a good option. My memory of the details is a little fuzzy because I just wasn't getting much sleep. And that's another thing I would say, just kind of as a quick side note. As fun as it is to build businesses, and as fun as it is to go out and do things and to create, you really have to pay attention to making sure that you're eating well and getting enough sleep and those kinds of things. And that sounds very cliche, but I'll make it I'll bring home the point and just say this. It's in the times when you're under the most stress that you need to have the best judgment. And a person's judgment is one of the first things that begins to decline when you're not getting enough sleep. And I made the mistake of pushing too hard for too long and not paying attention to a number of things, to include not getting enough sleep. And I think it actually slowed down the process of getting past some of these things, because it just, in retrospect, I think we could have made better decisions at different key points in time had I not been pushing so hard. And the bankruptcy sort of risk was looming every day. And, I would say that it was only by God's divine intervention that we didn't. But I also think that had we filed for bankruptcy, we would have been okay. Like, we would have figured things out, and life would have gone on. But I think one of the things that we did, that my business partner and I were able to see clearly enough at the time, was that we were young. I was 27 at the time. We were both 27 at the time. We were both young enough to where we had time to recover. Like, we were going to, it was going to work out okay. We would survive. And we both had young families at the time. And, that's an added pressure for sure. But we believed that we could ultimately get past it. And we also recognized that reputation is something that it's easy to underestimate just how influential a person's reputation can be in their lives, both positively and negatively. And we believe that how we conducted ourselves during that time in particular would inform decades of our future endeavors. And we tried to do everything we could to protect our reputation and do things in such a way that left people, even if they were unhappy that we couldn't pay them at the time, left them with a sense of, we're doing the best we can, and we're speaking the truth, and we're not trying to deceive them in any way. We're just struggling to work through, the challenges. And I think that absolutely played out that way. Like, I think it for years after that, the relationships that we had with some of our lenders in particular were unusual. I mean, they did things for us subsequently that they specifically said were as a result of how we had conducted ourselves in 2008, 9, and 10. So, wow. I'm not going to say that bankruptcy is always a bad option. From a policy perspective, there's a reason for it. And it serves as a backstop when a person is in a desperate place. I mean, it can obviously be abused, but I don't think that it's morally wrong for a person to seek bankruptcy. But it does leave a mark, and it's not a mark that we wanted to have. And we fought hard to try to avoid it. And I would encourage anyone who finds themselves sort of facing those same challenges to think about the long game, and to recognize that, sometimes the short-term relief can seem like the only option, but you really have to think about the long game and recognize that short-term relief can impede you in the years to come, and to just weigh that and consider that, and to not lose sight of those longer-term implications.
All right. The biggest, I guess, pain point is, like, it hurts your credit. And if you're a builder and entrepreneur, you need money, capital. So you might not be lendable. Is that kind of what you're saying? Is one of the biggest cons to that?
Yeah, essentially, and it could obviously vary widely in depending on the circumstances. But yeah, I mean, it leaves a mark that some lenders consider as sort of binary. If it's happened within the last certain number of years, they're just going to patently disqualify their interest in lending to you, and that's something that can hinder whatever a person is pursuing. I also think that I felt bad at the time for the people who were much older than us, because I saw companies and general contractors around us who had built a career for 20 or 30 or even 40 years, and then they were seeing that crumble in front of them, and they didn't have the time to really recover from that. So we felt fortunate. We felt fortunate to have learned the lessons, some of those lessons early on, but we were also very cognizant of how leverage can accelerate value creation. It can also destroy whatever value has been created. Warren Buffett's kind of famous for the concept of never betting the farm. With whatever you've built and created so far, it's never worth betting all of that for whatever that next level of increase might be. And we learn to really appreciate that sleeping well at night. We sleep better at night in how we manage in how we architect our financial structure, essentially. And one of the ways that we've learned to just sleep better at night is we pass up on a lot of opportunities that would require leverage, not because it doesn't look good in a spreadsheet and not because it probably wouldn't, not because it wouldn't be a good investment, but because stretching that extra incremental inch over and over and over can very quickly put yourself in a position of going to bed at night, worrying about how things might work out. And especially if there's a macroeconomic event or there's something that shifts or changes, we don't want to be put in a position of not being able to rest well at night if we can avoid it. And I think that all sort of stems from being very, very, very close to that precipice of trying to figure out how to make our own mortgage payment and how to put food on the table and how to put gas in the car and how to maintain whatever other obligations we have. And in doing all of that from a place of having been stretched too thin is a position that I would just caution everyone against. And it's a very, it's a tricky thing because especially starting out, there's risks that you take. Like there are risks that you have to take. And there are times when stretching yourself does make sense, but I would go back to, you can take risks. You can take measured, calculated risks. Risks are not, again, to use that term, binary. They're not either you take the risk or you don't. The best way to take a risk is to understand that there's usually a continuum and there's usually ways to accomplish the same thing, but in a different way that significantly de-risks whatever that investment may be. And you may give up some of the margin. You may give up, it may cost you something, but that premium can also be the thing that saves you from, sort of holistic, disaster. And that's one of the things that we really drew from that experience is just, we had failed to adequately de-risk. We were too focused on growth and had not been strategic in how we borrowed and the terms under which we borrowed. An example of that would be, we never missed a mortgage payment to any of our banks ever, but that doesn't mean that they can't call your loan. And we had not had the foresight at the time to architect our own liabilities to make sure that we were protected against essentially arbitrary, the arbitrary, calling of loans, across the board. And we paid a high price for it.
So what happened when they called your loans?
Well, there's a saying that is, if you owe the bank $1 million, they're in control. And if you owe the bank $10 million, you're in control. And essentially what that means is if you're a big enough liability to where you could really put a dent in their own balance sheet, they kind of have to negotiate with you. If and then additionally, if they know that you can pay it, then they can apply pressure and get you to pay it. If they know that you have no chance of paying back whatever the demand is, then again, you're at the negotiating table. And there's a lot of truth in that. And just sort of incidentally, we owed about $10 million at the time, which at the time for us was just a mountain of debt. But to answer your question, the conversation was typically, we'd get a call from a special assets manager. That's one of the things we realized is that all the relationships that we had developed at these banks for years kind of quickly transitioned to someone else. And, we would get calls from someone who we had never met before, whose job it was to, collect on these loans. And I will say this to the defense of the banking community at the time, they were under a lot of pressure from the Fed as well. And, they were trying to survive. So there's, we like to remind ourselves in our company, we don't fault the bankers. Like we don't have a resentment towards the bankers of that day. We were the ones who had the bright idea of borrowing the money in the first place. So it was our fault. But we would get called into their office and usually there was just a kind of a gruff conversation and demand that would be made. And I remember being yelled at a few times by some of these guys. And at first it really bothered me because I'd been raised to always pay your debts and always make good on your commitments. And, I was having to not make good on my commitments on a daily basis at that point. It was very uncomfortable. But I realized that, we had two advantages. One was we simply could not pay. We did not have the cash to just pay $10 million back to all these banks at the time. We had a lot of assets, but but we had no liquidity. The other advantage that we had was that we had already begun repositioning the houses to rental income. And we essentially just made the case like, look, if you want the house, I actually started carrying around a thing of keys with me. And I remember a couple times after getting yelled at in some bank president's office, I would just put the keys on the table and just say, I can walk out with these keys today, or you can walk out with these keys today. And if I walk out, we're going to continue managing the property and collecting the rent and making the mortgage payments. And eventually we'll sell the houses and pay you back. We both know what's going to happen if you walk out with the keys today. Banks are not good at managing properties, and they were completely overwhelmed, and it would be a disaster. And you would you'd be selling these assets for, some significant discount at some future date. And, just realize that we were in a position where we didn't really have another option, and they didn't really have another option. And, I would always walk out with the keys, and they eventually got paid back. So it worked out well. I think the distinction would be there were a few banks that took that really hard line position, but I remember a couple in particular that were just much more understanding, and they weren't happy. They weren't happy that we couldn't pay back the notes sort of on the spot, but they understood why, and they gave us the time, and they, instead of piling on more pressure and more problems that actually reduced the likelihood that things would work out to their advantage, they worked with us. And I would say, we still do business with some of those banks today. And one of the big reasons is those experiences and those interactions from now, 16 years ago. So the principle that I would just draw from all of that is simply, your reputation is always going to precede you. Whether it's the bank's reputation or whether it's your reputation as a real estate investor, your reputation will always precede you, whether it's good or bad. And it's going to precede you in ways that are very easy to underestimate. And especially if you begin to build a business of any appreciable size, if you start to become a significant landholder or landlord in a given market or construction company in a given market or whatever, people are going to know that reputation. And they're either going to bring opportunities to you as a result of that reputation, or they're going to send those opportunities elsewhere because of that reputation. And I think that I'll just go back again to the principle of, you got to think about the long game. You got to think about how the decisions that you make today are going to either help build the reputation by which you want to be known, or they're going to discredit the reputation by which you would want to be known. And every single decision is either placing a deposit in that bucket or it's drawing something out of that bucket. And it's especially in those moments when the markets are putting a lot of pressure on you, or the market as a whole is under a lot of pressure. That's when you can really shine and represent yourself and conduct yourself in a way that can pay dividends for a long time.
So good.
I want to respect your time. I know you have till 8. So Michaela, do you want to ask a few questions?
Yeah, no, I know we need to wrap up here, and I've just been listening this whole time, just super, really inspired by your story. I think the one thing I would just want to quickly ask is, in parallel to this entire journey that you walked out, Jordan, what did it look like for you on the personal family side of building a family? I mean, you started so young with real estate. How did that work to just eventually, you went to college, you went to law school, you built a family? Can you speak at all to that sort of merging of those worlds as you began to just go further in this kind of career journey you had?
Yeah, sure. I would say that I've learned a lot since then. And one of the things that I've learned is that, being physically present and being fully present are two different things. And, I tried to not travel much for business. I tried to be home every night, and I was almost always physically present, but I was rarely fully present with my wife and kids. And that's been a real lesson over the last couple of years. And I would caution anyone who is trying to aggressively grow or build something, whether it's a career as an engineer or in real estate investing or pursuing a PhD, whatever it is, that dogged pursuit of something can be a very seductive draw away from your family. And in being physically present is not the measuring stick. The measuring stick is whether or not you're really there with them emotionally and as a dad, as a husband, whether or not you are taking the time to really press into whatever it is that's on their mind. And I think a big lesson for me has been recognizing when I need to really just kind of seal off and ignore the problems and the questions and the emails and the opportunities, all the things that are sort of swirling around when you're trying to build and grow something. Being able to really seal that off so that you can be fully present is not an easy thing to do. And I would say, like, I'm still not great at it. I've gotten better at it. I was not good at it for a long time. And I thought I was, and that's the curious element. I thought I was doing a good job of sort of balancing that, but it's a very easy mistake to make, especially when you are trying to, again, aggressively grow and build, because it just takes a lot of energy. And you both know this, it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of study and learning and meetings and research. And there's an endless litany of things that can draw you away from the people that you love the most. And as fun as it is to be in real estate or in business, you have to know when to set that aside and choose what's more important.
That's so good. I love what you're saying about, like, I mean, I hate that this happened for you, but just kind of that life lesson of, okay, I was physically present almost the whole time, but just not fully there emotionally. And just like learning now here, you said what the last couple of years, really leaning into shifting that for you and your family. I think it's a really, really good reminder for all of us. Just like, okay, what does it look like to not just be in the room, but be there with your whole heart and your whole mind?
Yeah. And let me touch on one thing I want to briefly mention earlier. One that I think would be valuable to your listeners. One of the things that we have learned to appreciate much more over time, specifically with respect to the real estate industry, is that if you are understanding a given asset as an individual asset, and you're sort of weighing, here's what I'm going to pay for it, and here's the rental income that I can get off of it, and so forth. That is, sometimes that's the only option to sort of value that asset. But so much of the real estate industry is really about systems, and it's understanding how does that asset fit into the bigger system of the marketplace, and how can you invest in a way that maximizes the strategy or maximizes the advantage that you have in pairing that asset maybe with other assets, or in positioning that asset in a certain way that sort of fits into that market system. We won't have time to unpack all that today, but I would just say, like, that has helped us unlock a lot of value over time, is always asking the question, how does this asset fit into first of all, what is that system? And then secondly, how does it fit into that system? And kind of wrapping up with this, life and family are the same way. You can't think of things in isolation. You have to think of things multidimensionally. How does the family dynamic fit into the business dynamic, fit into the health dynamic, fit into the sleep dynamic, and fit into your social and friend relationships? All of these things are working together in different ways, and none of them are independent. And that's the mistake I think that I made. Just to use as an example, that's the mistake I made, is I thought that business and family were separate. And I thought that the bridge was being physically present. And I didn't understand how integral it all is and how complex it all is. And as a result, I was thinking about it in an oversimplified way, that I have since, come to view very differently.
Wow, that's good.
I feel like I could talk to you for days and days. There's just so much knowledge and wisdom and experiences in you. And I just appreciate you taking the time and being with us. And maybe we can do a part 2 sometime. Love to hear more about, like, you're unpacking that system, just like more of how you see everything working together. And especially, I'm curious, and this will be a future conversation, but I'm really curious what made you jump more into business when, things fell apart in 08, 09, 010 or 2010, like what made you stop doing that and just saying, hey, like there's other opportunities, maybe bigger opportunities, vision, whatever. So yeah, maybe we can chat more business the next time we have you on. So
yeah, I would say happy to do this at a future time. I'm looking forward to seeing the other episodes that you guys, I guess, are going to release here soon.
Yeah.
Two things to part with here. One is all I'm doing is regurgitating things that people told me before that I wish I'd learned earlier. So I'm happy to continue doing that. And of course, I'm still learning as we go too. And the second thing is, very briefly to that last question, so much of business is the same. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether it's real estate or manufacturing or service. We have come to appreciate that, call it 80% of any business is the same, has the same DNA as every other business out there. And it starts with people and leadership and culture and getting the right leadership and the right tune in place. And then there's all the kind of the nuts and bolts of understanding, how contracts work and insurance. And, that's going to apply to any business you get into. And then, so that stack makes up about, call it 80%. The other 20% is just the nuance, the difference between, real estate specifically, or the metallurgy involved in particular manufacturing, or the science of, aerodynamics and another, form of manufacturing. Those nuances represent the remaining 20%, but really 80% of the principles apply across the board. And that's one of the things that I enjoy, not just about real estate, but about business in general, is once you learn those things and you've adopted those things, you can migrate into a lot of opportunities. You're not stuck in a very narrow lane. You can apply those skill sets successfully in a lot of different ways if you understand that you have those skill sets, and if you have the confidence to try. So that'll be, I guess, a brief summary.
Yeah, it's good.
That's good, man.
Okay.
Well, thank you for your time. It's good seeing your beautiful face, and thanks for your wisdom.
Yeah, it was great to meet you. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be with you guys. Benjamin, it's great to have met you in person. Michaela, I'll look forward to talking with you again sometime soon. And if nothing else, good luck in your endeavors. And you're both very bright, and it sounds like you've had some. Benjamin told me a little bit about some of the stuff that he's doing. So I have a little bit of context in that way, but it's great to see people going out and building and trying things and enjoying the entrepreneurial adventure. And I would just encourage you to keep at it. Yeah.
And hey, if you're ever just over this way, I would love to say hi in person and welcome you. I'm sure you've done a ton of stuff here, but Knoxville is it's like I hardly have ever been there, and it's like on my radar as a place to go check out. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about what you're doing over there and just connect regionally, because we do a fair amount of stuff over in Knoxville as well.
Cool.
So,
very good.
But yeah, we'll look forward to next time.
Okay. Thank you guys. Good luck. See you.
See ya. Bye.